Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, May 17. A lot of things to talk about. Russia's President Vladimir Putin goes to China for a visit with China's President Xi Jinping. It's the 43rd time that these two leaders have met. Putin was looking for reassurance of Chinese support for his war effort in Ukraine, and Xi was looking for Russian support in his effort to counter Western economic and other pressure. How much did either get out of this meeting, and what does the budding Russo-Chinese relationship mean for global stability? Then we'll take a look at Ukraine, where Russia's forces have advanced in the northeast, gaining swaths of territory and putting the city of Kharkiv, this Ukraine's second largest city, in its gun sights. Is Ukraine faltering? And can U.S. aid that is finally starting to arrive help turn the tide? And finally, a growing debate within Israel about Gaza. For months, the United States and others have been pressing the Israeli government for a day-after plan, but Netanyahu has refused to deliver one, knowing that his coalition could never agree on its terms. But now, military commanders, security officials, and importantly, the defense minister have publicly called for a plan, one that very much looks like what the United States has been proposing ever since this war started. How will this latest debate in Israel play out, and what does it mean for the U.S. debate as the United States is leveraging the military aid it is providing in order to try to strengthen and change Israel's hand? Here to talk about these issues are three reporters who cover these stories. Ken Moriyasu is diplomatic correspondent at Nikkei Asia. Halley Toosi is senior foreign affairs correspondent at Politico, and Yaroslav Trofimov is chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Good morning, all three of you. Good afternoon here from Estonia, which is where I am. Great to see all of you back for another week of news, and a lot of news there is. Ken, let's start with you. Just before we got on the air, you sent us a tweet of Xi and Putin hugging. Who would have thought that anything like that was in store? These guys obviously are getting along. So tell us about the 2 days. How did the meeting go from both of your perspectives, and what should we take away from it?
Right. Thank you for having me again, Ivo. I think Xi Jinping is a John Mearsheimer realist, and he lays out a map. He looks at the balance of power and seeks to maximize his state's power. And I think that's what he's doing this time. He got a lot of pushback for saying that China and Russia are friends with no limit partnership. And 2 years after, he's doubling down on that. Not because I think for any ideological reasons. I don't think for a minute that he's trying to create an alliance of autocracies or like somehow pushing back the liberal international order for a world that looks like China. I don't think that. I think it's just that at this point in May 2024, he's looking at the relationship with the US, and he doesn't see any path to strengthening the balance of power. And this was not always the case, because in 2013, when he became president, he came to Sunnylands in California. And what he was proposing then was to basically create a G2 with the US. He said that the Pacific Ocean is vast enough for both of our countries. He was in effect saying, you keep that half of the Pacific, we'll keep this half. But that Obama didn't agree to that. So right now, I think he's looking at Russia and thinking that right now it's the best option to team with Russia. And I think he believes that by creating a position where Russia and China are aligning, this creates fear in Washington. And I think he believes that is the only way that Washington will change its current policy towards China and shift to a more conciliatory policy, because she believes that the only way to change America's attitude is to convince everybody in Washington that things will only get worse if we continue down this path. And I think that's what he's doing. It could be very similar to what President Reagan had. It's an idea of peace through strength. And I think that's where we are today.
Xi Jinping, as the Reaganite president of China, Yaroslav, interesting perspective. How do you look at Xi Jinping, and what do you think Vladimir Putin was trying to get at? It's an interesting relationship where Russia, of course, used to be the dominant member of that duopoly, and now it's clearly the demandeur and the weaker of the two links. Not something that Russia is used to, and yet this relationship is pretty unique in the way that both it's been personalized, but also in the strategic importance it has for Moscow.
Yeah, so I think this whole term of partnership without limits dates to the days before the full-scale invasion in February 2022. And there have clearly been very serious limits to this partnership after that. China has not supplied, as far as we know, Russia with lethal weapons or ammunition throughout this conflict, despite Russian requests. And as it extends the financial and economic lifeline to Russia, China is also very careful not to alienate the US, but above all the Europeans, because China's strategic goal is to split Western Europe from the US, and China knows that it can achieve that if it's an ally of Russia, because the situation in Ukraine and Russia is seen as a direct national security threat by many countries in Europe, not just in Estonia, but now also in Germany, and even President Macron described the war in Ukraine as existential for the future of Europe and the future of France. And so, yes, China is obviously economically much more important than Russia. Russia's GDP is about the size of Guangdong province. And Russia depends on Chinese largesse, and more with the trade and financial flows cut with the rest of the world. Russia is becoming an adjunct, sort of a raw material supplier to China. Having said that, the Russian military is a battle-tested, powerful military, and China's military has not been tested in any conflict.
No, I think that's absolutely true, and how just seen from Washington, which is where you're sitting, you have this debate going on in some ways that there is this new axis of upheaval, or that these two countries are really joining up to go after the United States. And Ken's and I think Yaroslav's perspective, which also exists, which is no, everybody is doing their own thing for their own interest. And don't assume that just because they're cooperating today, they will be allies and partners in the future. If their interests diverge, they will diverge too. How do you see it, and how do you think Washington is looking at this?
I think all of those things can be true at the same time and at any given time. I mean, it just kind of depends on the moment and the conflict and the issue. I like to call it the axis of evasion, because it's not just China and Russia. It's also North Korea somewhat playing a role, Iran playing a role. Occasionally, these are, the rogue states in the eyes of Washington, and they're getting together increasingly to evade sanctions, in particular, to see if they can find ways to have their currencies go around the dollar, to trade with one another, so that they aren't reliant on the United States or Europe as much. And, when you think about it to a degree, the U.S. is doing some of that in its own way, right? I mean, we are trying to do more nearshoring, do more of our own industrial policy, become less reliant on places like China. So some of these things, I think, were going to happen regardless because of the pandemic and other reasons. But no, there is this, ongoing world power Cold War in a way. I don't like that term very much, but you understand what I mean. Going on, that's making Washington very wary and watching this very closely. I actually wrote about the China-Russia bond and the concerns in Washington well before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This was back when President Biden went to see President Putin in their summit in Geneva. And I wrote a piece and talked to a senior administration official at the time. And they were telling me, we're really worried. This is pretty much an alliance at this point. At that point, Secretary Blinken had been getting briefings on it. I don't think they ever did this, but I think there was some talk of maybe even setting up like a person whose job it was to focus on this particular relationship at the NSC. I don't think that ever happened. But no, it's definitely an issue. There is this point at which they do have different interests. And I think Yaro is right to a degree. I mean, does Xi Jinping necessarily want to, hinge his fate on Russia? Russia's definitely the junior partner here, so probably not. But does he necessarily have to? I mean, he can find ways to balance the U.S. and Russia, and as we try to. I mean, at the end of the day, even the United States still says we will work with everybody when it comes to the bigger transnational issues like pandemics, like climate change, things like that. So yeah, I definitely think it's worth watching and worth worrying about. And I know people in Washington are worried, but it can go any number of ways.
Ken, just drawing on the excellent points that I think Nahal and Yaro made, is there a sense that there's a way for the West, including for Japan, which has direct interest at both Russia on the one hand, in part because of their neighbors, and China on the other hand, to see if there's a way to drive a wedge in between these countries in some way to their advantage, and if so, how would they do that?
I think it's important to understand what Xi is trying to do and the opportunities he sees by meeting Putin right now. If you look at the what happened on was it yesterday? Yeah, yesterday. They had a meeting first at the Great Hall of the People, and then they met the press. And then at the press conference, Putin said something very interesting. We have agreed to discuss foreign policy, including Ukraine, at night at a different setting. And then later in the evening, they had a walk in the Zhongnanhai complex, which is where his office is. And it was a no necktie discussion. So all the foreign policy was left to the evening, meaning the meeting during the day was all scripted. It was about like energy cooperation and investment and infrastructure. All of that was written by the bureaucrats. The foreign policy was left to a different setting with no necktie, meaning that there was a back and forth, and that was where they were really discussing what to do next. And the main discussion there was Ukraine, and Xi Jinping offered to hold an international peace conference between Ukraine and Russia in a setting that is equal to both. And Putin basically said that we are ready to what's the word here? Demonstrate sincerity in trying to reach an agreement. And I think Xi Jinping said that the solution has to be some kind of balanced and sustainable outcome, meaning that it has to be an outcome that is sustainable. So I think what Xi sees here is an opportunity to kind of mediate a conference. And then if that happens, he wants. So the reason why he hugged Putin at the end of the evening was he wanted that video footage. If you look at the way that the hug took place, they shake hands. Then she looks right, she looks left, checks if the cameras are going on, and then he very awkwardly hugs Putin. The reason I think why he's doing that is he wants this on the record, on the camera. So once there is a international conference and the Ukraine-Russia war is settled under the mediation of China, they're going to come back to this video over and over again, and they want the Nobel Peace Prize. And he needs a Nobel Peace Prize for a fourth term. Until now, his only problem, not the only problem, one of the biggest sticking points to him being leader for life is that he doesn't have any accomplishments to talk about. So that's why people in Washington are worried that there might be a Taiwan invasion, because if he unifies Taiwan, that's a slam dunk, no questions asked, fourth term. But he doesn't want to do that. But if he gets a Nobel Peace Prize for settling the Ukraine-Russia war, that's a ticket to the fourth term. That's my take.
So Yaroslav, I'd love to, and Nahal, I'd love to get your take on that. I think that it's fascinating, and we'll get back to the issue of what's happening in Ukraine and on the ground. But someone who really knows the Ukrainians and studies the Ukrainians extremely well. I read this in part as an attempt to duck the alternative peace conference, which is being held in Switzerland, supposed to be held in Switzerland in June. And the Chinese had said, well, we're not coming unless the Russians are coming. And the Russians aren't going to come, or at least we may not come. Anyway, how do you see the effort here? Is it a sincere effort to try to get to the solution, which presumably would be good for everyone as long as everybody abides by the solution, or do you see it differently?
Well, first of all, it's not clear whether China is coming or not to the Geneva conference. I think it can still come. Russia is not invited. The whole point of the conference is to have this unified international view on how the conflict should end, and sort of endorse the Ukrainian demand that Russia withdraws from all the occupied territories, including Crimea, including Donbass, which Russia is obviously not intending to do. Russia is currently on the offensive, trying to get more land. Now it launched this offensive into the Kharkiv region just a week ago. I think the Chinese don't really mind the war in Ukraine as long as Putin doesn't lose. I think this conflict festering right now is not really a problem for China. It's a little downside. A downside would be a collapse of the Russian regime, which is a strategic ally, or another downside for China would be having to interfere to prevent that, and then risking their relationship with the U.S. and with the Europeans. We spoke about this axis of upheaval. Well, the two other members of that axis, Iran and North Korea, don't have anything to lose. They don't have any international trade to speak of, except oil exports for the Iranians. They're already under sanctions. China has a lot to lose, and so that's why they're being very careful, and they portray themselves as a voice for peace, and they are still, all along saying we support Ukraine's territorial integrity. However, the Russian interests also have to be taken into account.
Now, how do you see it? Is this a serious attempt to try to see how a peace actually could be achieved, whether it's for a Nobel Peace Prize or just because it would be a good thing, or do you see it more as a tactical move to try to, in many ways, give Russia a saving face, as it was excluded from this peace conference that the Ukrainians and others, including us, are trying to put together in Geneva?
So, the Ukrainian effort has been going on for a while. They've held these conferences elsewhere. Their conditions are, I agree with Yaroslav, not ones that Russia are going to accept. But I think it's more for the Ukrainians to show the world, look, we really do want to negotiations. We're not just in this to fight forever. We want to find a way to bring this to an end. But these are our terms, and we want to get as many people on board as possible. In particular, they've been reaching out to countries in Latin America and Africa, trying to get them to rally behind this. Now, whether the Chinese will endorse this or not, or whether they want to weigh in, my sense, of past Chinese efforts to quote unquote come up with negotiated peace, it just, they don't really offer things that make a lot of sense on the ground. They'll issue basically a list of bullet points that effectively say everyone needs to behave themselves, and it just doesn't. There's not a lot of logic there. So sometimes I'm not sure that the Chinese have often grappled with the real nuances of negotiating a peace between two countries that are at serious odds over issues. And they just, I don't know, some of it seems just so much more for show than anything else. But I have to admit, though, Yaro, you said that you don't think it's a good thing for China if Russia loses. I'm not sure that's true. That just makes, as long as the Russian state doesn't collapse in a way that leads to some sort of migration issue or whatever with China, and I don't think that necessarily will happen. A weaker Russia could arguably be something more to China's advantage. They could find a way to become more influential over the Kremlin. They could see it as an even more junior partner they can manipulate and take advantage of. So I'm not saying you're wrong. I mean, I don't think we ever know with these things, but I wouldn't rule out the possibility that that might work to their advantage in a way.
I mean, a weaker Russia would probably be Russia that loses the war would probably be much more friendly to the West. Because there would probably have to be a regime change if the war is lost.
I think
that's a possibility.
It depends on who takes over, right? I mean, we've seen past regime changes that have ended up in not the friendliest of newcomers. So yeah.
Yeah, all good questions, and one thing we know for sure, we won't know the answer today. But they are. I think it's interesting to speculate, and I the way how you put it in terms of what the Chinese do when it comes to diplomacy, I think this is known as the Rodney King version of diplomacy. Can't we all just get along? I think that's what they're trying to do.
But at least Rodney King was posing a question. The Chinese are everyone needs to just behave themselves. It's like, dude.
I mean, they did achieve the deal between Saudis and Iranians. I mean, arguably because they were the only ones who talked about sex.
It was the Omanis and others.
Was already pretty far along. The Chinese basically swoop in at the last minute and try to take credit, and the Americans were like, "Fine, okay, if this works, fine."
Let's Yaroslav. Let's shift. Can you want to jump in here? Please do.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, Nahal is very correct in terms of China only having these bullet points that mean nothing. But I think China's feeling pretty good right now because the global South especially is beginning to look at America as having global double standards. So just by sticking to the talking points, it makes
They're
China
just beginning to notice that.
But relatively, China looks more like sticking to its principles. I think. So I think
that's right. I think that's right. I think other than the fact that their economy is not doing very well and they're having demographic problems and problems like that, I do think they think they're internationally they're not off all that badly. Yaroslav, let's switch over to Ukraine. Something you've studied and just written a terrific book on the first year and a half, 2 years of the war. Things are not going well for Ukraine. Just read today that the Russians have now, in the last few weeks, captured more territory than the Ukrainians captured in their entire counteroffensive last year. It isn't a lot, but it's more. It just shows you that the war is getting more dynamic, and it's happening quicker. And it seems that there is at least some possibility of major changes with strategic impact as opposed to so far pretty tactical moves. First of all, tell us what's happening in the last few weeks, and then secondly, why is it happening? And third, where do you think this is going?
Yeah, so I mean, there's been a major change this past week, actually, because up until now, all the fighting was in the areas that Russia declares to be Russia, in Donbass and in the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions of Ukraine that Russia, illegally annexed in 2022, September 2022, and so it claims it's just liberating "quote unquote" Russian soil. Now it launched an offensive in the Kharkiv region of Ukraine, around the second largest city of Kharkiv, which even Russia doesn't claim to be part of Russia. And the offensive was, much more successful than initially expected. Even though the Ukrainians knew about it, clearly there was a serious lack of preparations. There's lots of questions in Ukraine about alleged corruption and how the money was spent to build the fortifications that didn't turn out to exist, about the quality and the staffing levels of the units that were there at the border. In any case, the Russians managed to advance very swiftly in the first couple of days. And they entered the city of Vovchansk, which is a pretty big city near the border, and where street battles are going on now that Ukraine has scrambled units from other parts of the front and sent them to try to stop this advance, which has stalled in the last couple of days, but still going on. And Ukrainian officials worry that there will be another push in the Sumy region further north, towards Kyiv. All of that is happening because Russia has been steadily building up the size of its military. It's been recruiting about 30,000 soldiers every month, offsetting its losses, its huge losses. And Ukraine has been in the pickle. Ukraine, has not been able to generate the manpower, in part because of all the various political problems with the mobilization law, which only finally goes into effect tomorrow. And its losses were slower than its replacements. And so Ukraine is having serious manpower shortage in its military, compounded by 6 months of American military aid not coming through, and so being outgunned in the battlefield. And the more outgunned you are, the more losses you have, and the less you attrit the Russians. So this lack of American ammunition really contributed to this disbalance in manpower. So now finally the American weapons are on the way, but it could be too late to hold some ground. So Putin said today that he doesn't want to take Kharkiv. It's just a limited border operation. Well, he said lots of things in the past that didn't turn out to be true. So I think he's saying this because the current offensive has been stalled, but it hasn't been stopped yet.
So, do you think their goal was and remains to take Kharkiv, or do you think other theory is they're trying to create a buffer zone up there in the north, and the third is that they really are focused still on the Donbass and the Zaporizhzhia region, and they're just trying to force the Ukrainians to move troops away from those areas in order to defend up north, creating new openings in the south and in the east, or is it all three?
I think it's all of it. I think this overarching strategic goal for Russia is the same: is to extinguish the Ukrainian state and to take over Kiev and Odessa and Kharkiv and anything else they can. And how much they swallow depends on how much resistance they encounter. And so initially there wasn't that much resistance in Kharkiv, and the border is about 40 miles from the city. They've come about a third of the way. A little bit more, and the city of Kharkiv will be within range of artillery. So right now, to strike Kharkiv, they need to use missiles or glide bombs. Once they can actually sort of destroy the city with field guns the way they used to when they were in the first several months of the war, that's going to make it unlivable for many people there. And it is the second largest city of Ukraine. More than 1 million people live there. It's a major, major city.
Not good news, Nahal, in some ways in Washington, when finally the aid passed, what was it, 3 or 4 weeks ago, it looked like everybody was come back. Well, the aid's going now, so everything's fine, so we can, start worrying about other things again. It now looks like that in Washington, and people I talk to, I'm sure people you're talking to, they're saying, "Oh my God, maybe things are not as good as we thought it would be," and there's a growing concern that that the Ukrainians won't be able to hold the line, both where they've been fighting all along and perhaps even around Kharkiv.
Yes, and I have to say, I think that when Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin look at America, they see the infighting in Congress, they see our political polarization, and they look at that, and that gives them hope for their cause, because they think this is a house that is divided and it's not going to be able to stand. And sometimes when you look at what U.S. officials have to do to get things that seem very basic and very obvious done, it does seem like things are just on fire in Washington. Now, in terms of this, look, I think I was telling colleagues several weeks ago, I was like, look, this is the year. Like, my sense from talking to U.S. officials is Ukraine has to figure something out this year, or they're going to feel tremendous pressure, much more than before, to come to some sort of an agreement, peace talks, something with Russia. And that's if the Russians are willing to talk. Because no matter how much aid we're sending them with this package, I just think there is a sense that this cannot go on for that much longer, and that there just has to be some sort of either like a miraculous breakthrough or something to where we can see the end of this conflict in a way that may or may not make the Ukrainians happy, and may or may not leave them with as much of their land as they want. Now, I know one of the frustrations that the Ukrainians have is this focus on corruption that U.S. officials do constantly bring up, whether it's Secretary Blinken during his visit or others in these conversations. Of course, they talk about military aid. Of course, they talk about all this other stuff. But the U.S. always brings up the issue of corruption in Ukraine because it is a major concern. It's a major concern among Ukrainian people, and they're not going to drop it. And I know that this is really bothering Ukrainian officials because they're kind of like, well, like we've got bigger issues right now and you guys are dinging us on corruption. But, apparently it is an issue, even when it comes to the front lines, even when it comes to them, being prepared for this Kharkiv action in Russia. So that is also a continued point of friction with officials in Washington. I think things are I will say one last thing. One of the other things I think that the United States kind of needs to decide per se is, I'm not sure if that's the right word, is if Russia does make significant advances and there is no peace agreement or ceasefire, or whatever you want to call it, armistice, how is the U.S. going to continue to fund Ukraine in a way that allows it to stay on war footing, or are we going to also shift it more to an insurgency type of funding? I'm not sure that there's always necessarily a distinction, but we need to kind of, I think, start thinking about the possibility of a significant Russian success that might lead to the need for a Ukrainian insurgency, if that's possible. That's for me.
Yeah, I think if you talk to Ukrainians, obviously, what they would tell you now is that the U.S., despite all its aid, is forcing us to fight with our hands tied behind our back. Look at the Kharkiv offensive. The Russians masked at the border. They're flying the jets, the bomber jets in Russian skies and firing these glide bombs. And Ukraine is not allowed to use all these American weapons to target them on Russian soil until they cross the border. It's as if sort of the Brits during World War II were not allowed to strike Germany; they could only strike France, Belgium. It's a ridiculous situation, and yet this self-restraint in the Biden administration has been in place since the war began. I mean, this has been sort of the good rules of the game.
Yeah, I think Ken. I think both Yaroslav's and Nahal's point is that we're getting to a decision point on the United States, which is to say, are we going to be okay with Ukraine losing the war? Yes, there may be a counterinsurgency, which is currently what we thought would happen at the outset of the war. But the impact of that is not just the credibility of it's not about Ukraine; it's about Europe and the impact on NATO and by definition the impact on the United States. I think part of the question is either you shift the strategy, including in the way that Yaroslav talks about, allowing the Ukrainians to defend themselves, including hitting forces inside Russia, or you accept that the consequences of defeat, which are going to be big and will be read by allies, including presumably in Asia, as not a very positive sense. So how do you see this debate playing out in the U.S. and how are people seeing it in other parts of the world?
Yeah, and I think also Europe. If you, it's hard for me to imagine how the Europeans will stick with the U.S. on China if America walks away on the Europeans in Ukraine.
Because, yeah, that's true. I was actually addressing it to Ken, but you're right on that point.
Yeah, I was just going to say we discussed this last time, but for Japan, there's a big debate about whether America being fully committed to Ukraine and securing victory would be the ultimate deterrent against China, or would it drain America so much that it would actually benefit China? And the Japanese government so far has made the decision that win in Ukraine first, and then that would deter China. But, America is not the superpower that it was several years ago, and resources are limited. So if this drags on, it is a zero-sum game. The missiles that we need for the Taiwan contingency are being sent to Ukraine, and that's a matter of fact. The Japanese are trying to help out in that effort by co-production. That one of the takeaways from the Biden-Kishida summit last month was that Japan will start making munitions with the Americans in Japan using Japan's defense industrial base. But the end game is not very clear, so I kind of worry about that. One of my takeaways from the Xi-Putin meeting is that, like I said, Xi seems very interested in playing a role in bringing this to a political conclusion. He repeatedly said that the solution has to be political, not military. And I think he's true on that. And so I think one way would be to latch on to this momentum, because she clearly has a motivation to bring this to some kind of settlement and take credit for it. That might, aiding Xi Jinping's fourth term. I don't know whether that is in the interest of Japan and the US, but it's the only way to get China to cooperate, is to understand what they're trying to do and play along with that flow. Right, that's my takeaway.
Interesting, fascinating. Nahal, this is actually a good segue to Gaza, because part of the reason the United States is not providing certain weapons to the Ukrainians, including Patriot defensive systems, is because they're in the Middle East, being used to defend American troops there, which, of course, in the last 7 months, the risks to those troops have increased significantly. And so we now, there's a real incentive on the United States to try to figure out a way to get this war between Gaza and Israel to come to a conclusion. And we're having a debate about whether we can use the leverage of arms sales and arms transfers as one way. And at the same time, huge debate opening up inside Israel about what's the end game, with the government now, the defense minister openly arguing for things that the prime minister is openly arguing against. It's kind of interesting, as one commentator pointed out. When can you criticize a prime minister and not be fired? Apparently, when you're in Israel and in this government.
Yeah. Okay. Honestly, I would really rather be talking about the Drake versus Kendrick Lamar beef, but since we have to do Israel versus Hamas, let me just say this: this question of the day after, this dawned on me probably a little too late, but we have been in the day after ever since October 7th, right? Because every time that Israel attacked a part of Gaza, and then didn't do anything to follow up, didn't allow in humanitarian aid, didn't allow in some new authority to take control and hold that place so that Hamas didn't come back in, it basically failed to handle a day after. So now you have a situation in Gaza where a whole bunch of people have been jammed into one spot, Rafah, because that's the place where there's the most aid, the most ability to get anything. Because Israel, from the beginning, made a decision to severely restrict humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. And that has left most of the Strip essentially barren, not to mention in rubble. And so there hasn't been other places for people to go, even after the fighting has subsided in those places. And now Israel wants to go into Rafah, but that's where all the people are. And they don't have another place to go because of the humanitarian aid decision that was made early on, and the fact that they didn't take care of the day after every single day since October 7th. And now you have this situation. So what is happening? Netanyahu insists there's going to be a Rafah operation. They have gone ahead and done operations that do not meet the level at which the U.S. says is a massive invasion that the U.S. doesn't want, but which has been enough to get at least 650,000 people to leave that part of Gaza now, going to places where they don't have food, they don't have shelter, they don't have electricity, they don't have anything, but they have to leave because they're trying to escape the Israeli operations. And so you have this growing Israeli invasion of Rafah, which basically U.S. officials tell me they think very much can become a massive invasion that they have been warning against from the beginning, causing the humanitarian crisis exists, but exacerbating it to the point where they can't do anything. Now President Biden said that he has paused some very relatively small amount of aid to Israel, military aid, to send the signal that he does not want this massive invasion and attack on a major urban or crowded area. But I just get the sense that if Israel keeps pursuing this so-called small operation, and it just grows and grows and grows and grows, the U.S. is going to just be pulled into this slowly, and before they know it, it has become this big invasion. And the other things that are happening is, of course, there's tensions between Netanyahu and Biden over what is happening. The Israeli prime minister, he has been saying in cabinet meetings that reportedly that Israel is not a vassal state of the United States. At the same time, he's furious that there's been any sort of pause in military aid. And at the same time, the military establishment in Israel is upset with him increasingly because they are realizing finally, yes, we've been in the day after ever since, and we haven't done anything about it. And now there's Hamas reemerging all over the strip, and we're going to have to go back in and fight them again and again and again. Netanyahu was also did this interview recently on a podcast where he kind of sketched out his vision of what things could look like, which is, hopefully having some sort of an Arab-led multinational force that is, offers some security in Gaza, but with Israel having the ability to constantly go in and out of Gaza anytime it wants for security reasons. It's sort of like a Schrodinger's cat type of occupation. And I just don't know how it's going to work. You can immediately see, first of all, the Arab states being like not thrilled with the way this is going to go, and Israel effectively becoming the military occupier, which I think is the real picture here. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's going to be Israelis. It's going to be Israeli soldiers in the strip. They're already building posts. They're already building this corridor that the Washington Post wrote a great piece about that ran today. This is what it's going toward. We're going to be furthermore in the day after, even though we're already in it. So thank you for coming to my rant today. I don't know what else to say.
I mean, it's a good rant, and I think you're exactly right that we've been in the day afters from day one, and I would also point out that that's exactly what Biden told Netanyahu when he went to Israel on the first day. He said, "Don't make our mistakes that we did," and not thinking about the day after as on the day of is the same thing.
But Ivo, there's a significant difference. Look, in Afghanistan, we didn't bar humanitarian aid from going to Afghans after we invaded.
Yeah, but we didn't think about, I mean, George Bush, the day before we started bombing, said, "Can somebody ask me who's going to govern this place?" And when the goal was to actually remove the government, and the same was true in Iraq. So we didn't quite learn that lesson. Yaroslav, the way the military talks about this is counterinsurgency is clear, hold, and build. It looks like Israeli counterinsurgency is clear again, and clear again. Because, I think one of the reasons you're now hearing the criticisms from the military commanders is they are now going in for the third time to the same place in order to remove Hamas that they have removed, months and months prior to that. And it seems to me this can't continue. Quite apart from what's happening in Rafah, is how long can the IDF continue to basically wipe the place clean and then have to do it all over again?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very different situation from Afghanistan and Iraq because it's not a counterinsurgency. I mean, the Israelis are not trying to win hearts and minds. They're not trying to install a friendly regime or any regime for that matter. I think the goal there is to degrade the military capabilities of Hamas, which have been degraded, and then prevent Hamas from rebuilding itself to pose the kind of threat that it used to pose. And if you talk to Israeli officials, they say, well, if it costs the lives of 5 or 10 soldiers every month, that's a price worth paying. And that's the calculation that Israeli government and the voters will have to make at the end of the day. And obviously, that policy is premised on Netanyahu's ideology, which says that no political solution is possible. Kind of going back to this whole mowing the grass paradigm that you had, and and that clearly offers no hope to the Palestinian people of any political solution.
No hope to the Palestinian people of political solution, Ken, but also no protection for the Palestinians who happen to be sitting there.
Absolutely not. Yes.
Right. I have a rant too, like Nahal, if I may. So there was one really interesting thing from the readout of the Xi-Putin summit. Sorry to keep going back to this. It says the two presidents are of the view that it is urgent to solve the Palestinian-Israel conflict. And then it says only Xi Jinping said that the question of the Palestine must be solved on the basis of the two-state solution. Putin didn't say the two-state solution, although the Russians have always said the two-state solution. And I'm wondering, why is he not joining Xi Jinping in saying the two-state solution? So when I talk to some ultra-Orthodox Jewish friends, they tell me that this effort by the US to force a two-state solution on Israel is just unacceptable because it's just too dangerous. And if the US insists on shoving this down Israel's throat, that threatens the existence of the state of Israel, which makes America a strategic enemy of Israel, and that Israel will have to look for alternative partners. And this is ridiculous because probably Israel will always be with the US. But if that is one option, who are the other people that Israel might team with? And Israel doesn't need money. Israel doesn't need technology. What Israel needs is a veto at the UN. And considering that the US and the UK will probably be together, and if those are not the option, that leaves China, France, and Russia. And China, Israel knows, doesn't have the stomach to stay with Israel through wind and rain. That leaves France and Russia. And I don't think Russia really cares if Israel goes to France or goes to Russia. But that situation where Israel and the US is divided is good for Russia in terms of the balance of power. So reading the Xi-Putin statement, I thought maybe Putin is thinking that maybe it's not the best to push for a two-state solution here. So that was my rant.
That's just a bit odd because Russia has been very much on the side of the Palestinians so far during this conflict, including at the United Nations. So, if suddenly Putin were to switch to support Israel, that would be quite the change. Also, I think it's overstated the role of the UN in all this. Like, I don't understand why Israel, really cares that much about the UN. I don't necessarily think it does. I think we're pretty much seeing that system is just not working, and people are willing to ignore the UN and the Security Council if needed. So it's, I don't know. I guess I'm just not buying that.
I mean, if you look at Netanyahu, that was his shtick all along. He was cozying up to Putin. He went to Moscow for the Victory Day celebrations. He wore the St. George ribbon in a symbol of Russian nationalism. He refused to support Ukraine in any way. And he was flirting with China. He sold the port high to the Chinese, and he was even speaking about how we can balance America with China. Obviously, on October 7th, it became clear this was all complete nonsense, and without America, Israel could not defend itself. And so I think all that talk has vanished. But having said that, Ivo, you mentioned the Patriots. Israel has more Patriot systems now that are mothballed and not being used than Ukraine has to defend against the Russians, and yet they're not being given to Ukraine.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting and complicated set of issues, and unfortunately, we run out of time because this is it's just a fascinating. I mean, I love the rants that we're having here, so that's part of it. I hadn't noticed, and I kind of bring it to our attention that there is this distinction between Xi Jinping and Putin on the two-state issue. It suggests at least that the Russians want to keep their options open, and that includes potentially being more pro-Israeli, because there is that, because as Yaroslav said, this relationship with Netanyahu and Putin, which is important. Of course, there's a large Russian population. Russian-born population in Israel, but we'll have to figure out.
To think about the rest of the world. I mean, they also have to think about the global South. Like if they switch to Israel, they lose a lot of other people. So
yeah, I don't think they're going to switch. But being for a one-state solution actually doesn't necessarily mean you're anti-Israeli or anti-Palestinians. They're both sides now want the one-state solution. They're disagreeing.
Which state?
who owns it? But fascinating. As I said, fascinating discussion. Really want to thank Ken Moriyasu of Nikkei Asia and Halley Toosi of Politico, Yaroslav Trofimov of the Wall Street Journal for your insights. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in again this week. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Till then, have a great weekend.